Hello comrades, it's me Matt. I appreciate you stopping by on today's video. Hope you're having a good one. We are talking about artillery. Yes, my favourite trade at the moment because I am currently an artillery gunner. We're talking specifically about Russian artillery today, and as you can see from the video, we're looking at the beautiful 122mm D-30 howitzer. Now, Russian field artillery is huge. It is massive in every sense of the word, whether it be from self-propelled guns, rocket artillery, or standard field artillery howitzers. And the D-30 is no exception to that. It is truly a weapon that's been around for a long time, but does exactly what you need it to do. Put rounds down range at high velocity, at high range, and with a lot of firepower behind it. Now, the D-30 has been developed since the late 1950s at OKB-9 to replace the M30 howitzer. A group of designers led by F.F. Petrova, having studied captured German developments, proposed a completely new scheme for Soviet field artillery. Instead of the already traditional two sliding beds of the weapon system, the Carriage actually had three beds, and the chassis was located on the upper machining. One of the three beds was motionless, and the other two were separated by 120 degrees relative to when the howitzer was brought into combat position. Now, these guys look like they're having a lot of fun spinning this gun around, but it's a huge feature for the gun, being able to traverse to any bearing or, any elevation quickly without having to relocate the trails. But without relocating the trails has its own inherent problems. Before the gun could go into this configuration though, the crew had to actually jack the supported weapon system up onto a pallet of the lower portion of the gun, and the wheels of the chassis were hung above the ground. The time to transfer the howitzer from travelling position to combat position was 1.5 to 2.5 minutes, which really isn't too bad. The main advantage of such a scheme is the ability to conduct a circular attack without separating the course of the gun. The gun was also given a new layout of the barrel. When the recoil brake and the knurler are located on top, it made it possible by lowering the height of the line of fire from 1200 to 900mm and making it much easier to camouflage it on the battlefield. The use of the gun in the anti-tank defense system role, along with the main task of suppressing firing points and destroying field structures, really suited to this configuration. It was a lot of effort to get the gun in place though, and a lot of manual hand cranking and a lot of pivot staking to actually put it in place. You basically had to hammer those trails in with these huge pegs to hold it in place, unlike traditional trails that actually have spades that dig into the soil themselves. The muzzle brake was massive with the additional towing pintle on the front too, which made it a little bit more difficult to actually elevate the gun when having to come into action. The springs are actually upgraded from the original M30 design to compensate for this, so that when people actually traverse or elevate this gun, they're not fighting the gun and the additional weight on the end of the barrel, because believe it or not, that much weight hanging off the end of the barrel is quite difficult to move, even if you're given additional equipment inside the gun to help you do so. Also, the new use of the new layout gave the D-30 a lot more significant improvements and characteristics of the gun compared to the M30 howitzer. The elevation angle of the barrel increased from 63.5 to 70 degrees, which, believe it or not, is actually a significant change. The maximum firing range increased from 11.8 to 15.3 kilometers, and all of this combined with a projectile weighing 21.7 kilograms makes it easy to destroy hidden enemy targets behind hilltops or in defilade, and really did give the Russian military a lot more firepower when it came to field artillery that was very accurate. And when I say very accurate, I mean the gun's recoil is really not being affected at all with those trails. When you look at the M777, you even look at my beloved C3 howitzer, the trails move at least about 1.5 feet into the soil when they're initially taking that first round. This gun's seated so tight into the floor, and with the recoil system and the pressure actuator that it has inside of there, there's literally barely any recoil adjustment put onto this gun. It does all the work for you, which is really, really good. And we call this displacement. Basically, when you're aiming at a target, looking through the optics to line up with your collimator and the rest of the aiming devices that we use in the artillery to make sure rounds go on target accurately, displacement is when the round is fired, it obviously shifts the gun. But for these guns, they just don't shift. It's almost like they're concreted into position, and that's, like I said, one of the disadvantages of having these kind of systems is, yes, it's very accurate, but it does take additional manpower and effort to get that trail and that base plate of the gun actually locked into the floor. So, yes, it's accurate, but my goodness, trying to get those stakes out of the ground and put them into the ground is literally like anchoring it into concrete. But, as I said, with less displacement means better accuracy of the guns overall when they're firing. Now, the wedge, breech block, and semi-automatic equipment facilitate the work of calculations that made it possible to increase the rate of fire up to 8 rounds per minute against the original 6 rounds from its predecessor, which had a piston gate. The 122mm D-30 howitzer was adopted by the Soviet Army in the 1960s, receiving the index product of 2 Alpha 18. Now, the recoil system is really cool. Basically, once the round is fired, the brass casing is ejected out itself, unlike some of the Western artillery of the time, where the casing would have to be ejected via a manual lever, or breech operating lever as we call it, to actually extract the brass from the gun. But in this particular instance, the casing is projected straight out the back once the round is fired, which looks amazing, but is also bloody dangerous. I would not want to be around with that casing shooting out of the bottom there. I'd be pretty scared of it, but you know, I'm sure these guys are trained to avoid that area a lot. Now, the howitzer also consists of multiple recoil devices, a very heavy-duty gun carriage, and the sighting devices are that of primitive for the time when it was originally designed capabilities, but have slowly upgraded in time. The barrel consists of the main pipe, the muzzle brake, the grips, the breech, and the bolt. A multi-slot muzzle brake is mounted on the front of the barrel, and it's a beast, absorbing about 50% of that recoil energy, once again additionally helping it to stay nice and accurate, because that recoil is huge and the muzzle brake is reducing the amount of input to the gunner when he's actually adjusting those sights. When the gun's placed at high angles to keep the projectile from falling out during loading and the large elevation angles, there's a special holding mechanism inside the bolt, which allows the secondary loader to put the cartridge case in behind without the projectile falling out on top of him. The carriage consists of the cradle, an upper machine, a lower machine, a balancing mechanism, vertical and horizontal guiding drives, wheel travel, suspension mechanisms, and a mechanism for mounting the gun in the travelling manner. The recoil devices for this gun at the time were very sophisticated, consisting of a heavy-duty recoil pad, a brake of the retractable parts, and all located in a trough-shaped cradle above the barrel. Sighting devices consisted of a panoramic sight and telescopic sight for either doing fire missions for long range or indirect fire, or actually tank engagements. Yes, this could be utilised as an anti-tank gun just as much as it would be used as a howitzer to engage long-range targets. The barrel, cradle, recoil devices, and sighting devices make up the rocking part of the gun, which is set in a rotational motion relative to the axis of the barrel cradle pins when the barrel is aimed in the vertical plane, basically giving it free spinning, capabilities beyond the base plate. The swinging part and the upper machine with the combat shield and wheel travel, and the balancing mechanism and the aiming drive form of the rotating part, which is set in a rotary motion relative to the axis of the combat pin and the upper machining portion when aiming the barrel in the horizontal plane. The mechanisms for aiming the gun at the target mounted on the upper machine allow firing with vertical angles from -7 degrees up to +70 degrees, with elevations up to 22 degrees, and horizontal firing angle is 360 degrees, basically giving this thing a 360 degree traverse, which is really useful. And with the elevation angles exceeding 22 degrees, circular firing is limited only in the areas where the breech is located above the beds. The lower lathe and the 3 beds and the hydraulic jack form part of the tool that is stationary when aiming the barrel, basically meaning that you cannot traverse the gun and the breech over one of those cradle legs or the trails, because you'll actually hit the breech into the legs, which, it doesn't give you 360 degree aiming capability technically, because you can't fire the gun into the trails. To protect the crew from small arms, bullets, and fragments of artillery shells and mines, a shield cover was mounted, and the upper machine actually gave a lot more protection to the crew than the original M30 design. To transfer it to the stowed position, the movable beds are brought together with the fixed ones and attached to it by a pin. After that, it's connected with a special frame to the barrel at its muzzle. The howitzer is towed by barrel forward, similar to that of the M777, with a pivot beam used to connect it to the tractor, and that's attached to the bottom of the muzzle brake. There have been reports of the past of this muzzle brake actually being damaged by people not connecting this up correctly and towing it with a vehicle that is way too fast to be pulling something of that weight. And when you put your brakes on a vehicle like that, you're actually going to shift that towing pintle up and down on the muzzle brake, and believe it or not, that can affect the gun quite heavily. The D-30 is transported normally by a 3-axle army truck or a 6x6. The presence of a torsion-sprung wheel allows the howitzer to be towed at quite high speeds, up to 80 km an hour, and unfortunately this is one of the reasons why it had problems. Crews were believing that they could just speed up all over the place with this thing and not take into consideration the braking force it takes to stop that much weight on the end of a towing pintle to the barrel, which is the most integral part of the gun. Both on highway and over terrain, though, it was actually able to be towed very quickly with the suspension it had. For movement in deep snow, the howitzer was equipped with a ski mount. Shooting from the ski rig, however, was completely impossible. The comparative compactness of the howitzer made it possible to carry out its landing also from the air. For this, special platforms were provided. Shooting from the D-30 Alpha howitzer is conducted with the same types of ammunition that are used for firing the M30 howitzer. The single case loading shots with a number of variable charges and fragmentation, with high explosive fragmentation, cumulative smoke, lighting, and propaganda shells. Yes, you could actually launch shells with leaflets in it, as well as shells with arrow-shaped lethal elements. Basically, darts. The direct firing range is 850 meters, which would allow you to knock out a tank of the time quite easily with a 122mm anti-tank gun. The maximum range of this gun was 15,300 meters, or 15.3 kilometers, which is pretty acceptable for its time for a 122mm projectile. In the 1980s, an active rocket projectile was created for the D-30 howitzer with a maximum range of 21,000 meters. A standard high-explosive projectile penetrates roughly 200mm thick plate of armored steel located at an angle of 90 degrees at a distance of 630 meters. The D-30, however, was primarily designed to destroy and suppress enemy manpower and fire weapons from distance, either in an open or in field-type shelters, also destroying bunkers and other field-type structures. Unlike some of the more modern counterparts of the D-30 of today with the Russian military and other NATO countries around the world, it could not fire dual-purpose conventional munitions, basically mines from the sky, which are designed as heat rounds to come from top-down attack onto tanks. This is because the gun was not designed to be able to fire those kind of projectiles in the configuration that it has with 122mm type of cartridge and round. However, believe me, this gun could still do a lot of damage on tanks of today without any need for that kind of ammunition. 122mm is still quite a formidable projectile to be coming down onto a battle group of armor. The D-30 howitzer has become one of the most common artillery systems in the armies of the Warsaw Pact member states. In addition, the howitzer was widely exported and licensed in some other countries as well. In units of the subdivisions of the Soviet Army, which were armed with the D-30, it was highly appreciated for its exceptional reliability, ease of maintenance, high fire performance, and as mentioned before, accuracy. It was used in many military conflicts in the 1970s all the way up to the 2000s. The first baptism of fire the D-30 took place was the Afghanistan War. Specifically, the howitzer was used in the OKSVA unit and has proven itself very well during that conflict. Ironically, in this footage that we're looking at right now, the D-30 is actually used by the Afghan National Army, and gun crews still to this day are being trained and utilizing it in their own batteries, which is kind of odd to know that potentially the people who are firing this gun right now, they're, brothers, cousins, grandfathers of the time, may have been the ones actually having projectiles fired at their, family history, which is a little odd, to think when you look at the Afghanistan dynamic and wars that have been fought, that this gun has been on literally both ends of the spectrum here, which is really, really strange. But hey, this gun's still being used heavily today all over the world, not just in Afghanistan. There's obviously a lot of Eastern Bloc countries still utilizing the D-30 and its projectiles that it has in mass amounts. I mean, this gun is definitely not to be said to be in the retirement bucket. The Russian military is still heavily using this gun also. It's formidable. It does what it needs to do. It's old school, but it works. However, they do not produce any more of the D-30s, and they pretty much finished off production from the 1960s all the way up to 1989 in plant number 9 back in its home state of Russia. Now, the gun, I have to admit, is a peculiar one. It does have that really cool swivel capability. It allows it to fire just about everywhere. Very good accuracy, but in the grand scheme of things, it's a little bit more complex than some of the other guns out there of today, and also it standardizes the setup of a sight. It cannot use electronic capabilities for the most part. It's utilizing everything from a standardized sight, which personally I have no issue with. I'm an old school gunner using a C3 howitzer, which is literally using the old school sight, the number 3 sight, which is everything done via, information sent from the CP. You're not trying to line up with electronic systems similar to the M777, where you got, your little green bars lining up, making sure everything's tied in nicely. And I like that. I like the fact this doesn't rely upon electronics. It can be used in a third world country like Afghanistan, by a army that is not fully, you know, set up for this kind of gun. They're being trained by the Americans, as you can see in this video. It's ironic that the Americans are teaching the Afghans how to use a Russian weapon, but hey, that's where we're at. But really, really cool bit of kit. The accuracy, I've been told from people that I've spoke to, have trained and utilized this gun, is second to none. And that really comes down to that displacement, right? If the trails aren't moving, the gun doesn't move after each round, you're going to be able to put another round just about right in the same spot every time. Western guns have the same capability, it just takes a bit of time for them to settle in. Those trails really have to dig into the soil. If you were to try and set this up in a snowy conditions, I can't imagine hammering those stakes into the ground. I mean, they're like 2.5 foot stakes. And they're huge steel stakes. To get them into the ground must be an absolute nightmare, and even worse to get them back out again, especially once the gun's recoil has really embedded them into the soil, or ice, or permafrost, you know. But a very, very cool gun. I love the muzzle brake on this thing. It's just like overpowering, obnoxious beastliness of Russia. It looks really, really cool. And a formidable artillery howitzer. Really, really like the D-30. Hopefully you really, really liked my video, and if you did, please leave me a like. Click that like button, it really does help. Also, leave me a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts about this gun, or other videos you want me to produce in the future. I'd like to do a massive shout out and thank you to everyone who's been supporting my Patreon, my PayPal, and being a member of the channel. It really does mean a lot to me. Also, if you want to be notified of any upcoming videos of the future, please click the little bell by the subscribe button so you can be notified when new videos are released from my channel, because YouTube doesn't like military content, and as you can see by my channel recently, it's really not doing so great in terms of viewership because of that. Maybe it's just my content's terrible, I don't know, but I really would appreciate the like and the comment. It does help kind of push up my videos in the suggested feeds, and I hope you all have a safe and wonderful rest of your day. All the best, bye bye.